Hello, I'm Peter Burgell, and I will be your host for the following program, which is entitled The Militarization of America, Who Wins and Who Loses. It was prepared by the Fund Our Communities Bring the War Dollars Home Project of Maryland with input from Oregon Peaceworks. Here are our websites. If you want to copy them down quickly, if you don't have a pencil now, we'll come back to them later at the end of the program. The first question you might ask is, how much do we spend on the military? Here's a picture of the federal budget for 2012, this year. And this is a part of the budget that's called the discretionary budget. First of all, we have the part of the budget that has to do with human resources, general government, physical resources, and just about everything we want government to do other than the military. Here we have the military, which is divided into the current military, which is what we're paying for it this year, and the past military, which is significantly the debt and the money that we spend on the veterans. However, the government understands that we don't really think that we should be spending half of our discretionary budget on the military. They know that the public will be a lot happier if it's a lot smaller number, say around 20 or 25%. So in 1969, under the Johnson administration, during the Vietnam War, the government came up with the idea of the unified budget. And to get the unified budget, they added in the Social Security programs, the other programs such as that, which would not normally be in the discretionary budget, and they put it all together as one large unified budget. And then, of course, the military portion of that looks a lot smaller. It's not really any smaller, of course, but it looks smaller when you present it in a pie chart like this. So let's take a look at what's involved with that. The President's proposed and discretionary spending for the next fiscal year. As you can see, it's composed of a discretionary portion, about 31%, a mandatory portion, which is 62%, and the interest on the debt that we're carrying, that's the national debt. Now, looking at the mandatory spending, it's composed of a bunch of items that have already been decided that we're going to spend for this year. So, in other words, a law was made last year or the year before that, that said we're going to spend this much money in this fiscal year on this amount of money. So that decision has already been made. And as you can see, the largest portion of that is Social Security, unemployment, and labor. And those are funded primarily by special taxes that we pay separately from the discretionary budget. You also see another big chunk of that is Medicare, which is another program that's funded in that manner. Now here's the discretionary spending for 2013. As you see, a huge segment of it, more than half, is devoted to the military. And on the left side of the picture there is everything else. So education, government, housing, community, veterans benefits, everything else is separate from the military portion of the budget. Now let's try and get a feel for this a little bit by asking ourselves, since 9/11, since the 9/11 disaster in 2001, how much have we spent on the military versus how much have we spent on some of the other things that we want to do with our government? If you look there on the right, you see the Pentagon's base budget, $5.6 trillion in that decade. The Iraq and Afghan wars are the next largest piece of it, $1.6 trillion. Then you get Homeland Security and nuclear weapons. And after that, after all these military expenditures, you get the budgets of agriculture, commerce, interior, labor, transportation, and the EPA, all put together, combining to less than even the nuclear weapons portion. Now, it's fairly difficult to really understand what these huge numbers really mean. Millions, billions, even trillions of dollars. What does that mean? So let's get a feel for these numbers. Let's take a look, for example, at the amount of money spent by the Pentagon in 1 year versus the entire spending for the National Institutes of Health since it was created in 1938. That $553 billion, which was the 2012 base military budget, is greater than the total amount ever spent for the National Institutes of Health. Here's another way to look at it. The United States military spending outranks all other countries. In fact, it outranks all other countries put together. But let's take a look at the next few countries in line. We have the United States way across the top there. Then we have China, France, the United Kingdom, Russia, Japan, Germany, and Italy. And please notice that none of these countries is currently an enemy of the United States. China is a huge trading partner. The other countries are in NATO, except for Russia and Japan. So we are talking here about spending an enormous amount of money, much more than any other country in the world, but much more than any other country in the world, to defend ourselves against whom? Here's another way to look at it. We have the United States there, the big dot on the left, and then the other countries that we just noted. And it's just really incredible to realize, as you see there on the right, that the next 10 countries in terms of military spending don't even begin to come up to the amount of money spent by the United States if you take them all put together. Here's another way to look at it that's really important. How much money do we spend on defense or on war per capita? That's each one of us. And as you see, in the United States, it's somewhere between $2,500 and $3,000 per person, which is far more than any other country in the world. So you might ask, where does all this money go? What do we buy with all this money? Is it worth it? Let's find out. There's 4 categories that we're going to look at here. First, the Pentagon spending, then the war costs, foreign military bases, and war profiteers. Let's start with the Pentagon spending. Here we see that since 2001, the military budget, as shown in the dark blue color, has been rising steadily. But beginning right about that time when we first went into Afghanistan, the war funding budget, which has to be added to that military base budget, has also been increasing. So the total has increased an enormous amount. In fact, as you can see, it's more or less tripled. And let's ask also the question, what's in the military budget? This is a blow-up from that pie chart that we had at the very beginning of the show, where we looked at the current military and the past military. As you can see here, we have the total outlays of the DoD budget, the Department of Defense budget, $707 billion of that, but we don't have, but that doesn't tell the whole story. That involves things like military personnel, operations and maintenance, procurement, so forth. But there's also the non-Defense Department military spending, which includes retiree pay and the health care for the military. It includes the nuclear weapons portion, which is actually in the Department of Energy. It includes 50% of the National Science and Administration, international security, and other smaller amounts. So it comes up to a total of $869 billion for this particular year. We also might ask, where does the money go in terms of the war costs? The total direct cost of both wars at this time is $1.26 trillion. And we're talking about Iraq and Afghanistan through 2011. So we have spent enormous amounts of money, $1.26 trillion. Trillion dollars. $1 trillion, incidentally, is 1,000 billion since we started these wars. To bring that into focus, in 2011, the United States spent more on the war in Afghanistan than any other country in the world spent in total on its military. You remember from the slide previously that China was the second in line for military spending. Well, they did not spend as much in a whole year on their entire military as we spent just on the Afghanistan portion of the wars. What is that amount? $122 billion. Well, let's take a look at our total state budget shortfalls for that same year. That was $112 billion. In other words, if we had not spent $122 billion on the war in Afghanistan, we could have funded the budget deficit for every single state in the Union and had plenty of money left over to do something else. In fact, $33 billion, which is the escalation since 2010, in other words, the amount of money more that we spent in Afghanistan since 2010, the next year, amounted to $33 billion, which is 600,000 U.S. jobs. And we're not talking about minimum wage jobs here. We're talking about $55,000 a year family wage jobs. The total estimated cost of our wars in Iraq and Afghanistan comes to someplace between $4 and $6 trillion estimated. Now, why is that so much? Because we will continue paying for these wars for quite a long time as we pay for the debt that we incurred for them, as we pay for the medical expenditures of all the people that got hurt, and so forth. Let's just take the $3.5 trillion as a number there, since it's a little less than the lowest of the estimates there. With that amount of money, $3.5 trillion, we could send every 18-year-old in the United States to a state university. We could pay all their education expenses, their tuition, their fees, their room and board for 4 years for each one of them, and we could do it for the next 133 years. That's how big a number that is.